Okay, so Jason Maynard from Cisco is going to do a talk on active and passive defense. We also understand that there are some NATE students who are coming into this, so just a show of hands, are those NATE students here? Woo-hoo. Welcome. Great, good. Okay, so let's get this up.
All right, everyone can hear me? Yeah? Awesome. All right, so I'm Jason Maynard. I'm focused on the technical aspects of Cisco's cybersecurity portfolio, but really focused in general around security, not product specific, right? So anyways, when I was thinking about what I want to kind of present, some of the challenge I see when I'm out and talking to customers, was that there's a big focus on passive defense, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what passive defense is. There's not a huge focus on active defense. So today, there's going to be a little bit of everything for everyone, right? So if you're in leadership, there's some things that you might want to take back to the team. If you're more on the geeky side, we'll talk a bit about NetFlow and maybe DNS analysis and how that might help you determine what maybe an adversary might be doing in your environment. Obviously, that's only one of many techniques that you can leverage, but it's a good way of capturing some intel in your environment, right? So if we have lots of people in here that manage environments, I would love to see, and I'm not sure if you guys are willing to say, but how many people actually ingest NetFlow or IPFix or SFlow or JFlow and actually use that, not from a network perspective, but use it for security, right? So we're building these defenses or traditional defenses to mitigate risk, but yet you don't know what your network's doing, right? Day in and day out. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as what DNS can do and provide you. So real quick, I'm going to talk about operational and informational technologies, right? There's a big focus, obviously, on IT a lot of the times, but operational environments are now being exposed. Businesses want data, right? Today, you can go and order food, right, and watch the driver come to your house, right? The best I had as a kid was 20 minutes, Domino's, it's free, right? But you never knew where they were. You were just hoping they'd be here, right? Today, you guys are seeing things real time. People know when, consumption for power is high or low. So we'll talk about each of those because they're both important and they both require security, both passive defenses, but also active defenses as well. We'll talk about hard exterior, soft interior. I've seen that still a lot out with all of my customers that I talk to day in and day out, right? We've got this hard crust, but we got this really gooey, chewy middle, right? We'll talk about passive and active defense, very high level, the differences between the two, and then we're really going to focus on active defense itself. So that's where we're going to look at threat intelligence, right? Asset identification, network security monitoring, incident response, and then finally threat environment and manipulation, right? So what do we take from the things that we learn about the environment and then use that to feed back into our passive defenses, right? So we take that knowledge and then we feed it back into passive defenses to start mitigating that risk. So when you look at operational and informational technologies, they're both important, right? So they might be treated a little bit differently. So OT, has got engineers, right? And, real engineers with the ring, right? And then IT's got engineers without the ring, right? A lot of times. Not to say you don't have a ring. Somebody might have a ring. But they're very much the same. And they can learn from each other, right? IT can learn about the operational requirements, right? And why it's important to make sure availability is core, right? Integrity is second, and confidentiality is third. If you were going to rank them, you could talk to people that will argue all day long that confidentiality and integrity is just as important, but without availability, the operational environment will suffer, right? Where IT, you've got CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? If you were to rank them. Again, you could talk to someone in IT and say, availability is just as important as confidentiality. But if you were to rank them, that's typically how it goes. So now we've gotten some controls between OT and IT, but how many organizations are actually doing active defense in the operational environment? And I'm going to say very few, right? I talk to a lot of customers. And The problem with this is OT is now, it used to be an island, right, all by itself, but now we've got bridges into that island, right? They're not segregated anymore. So we'll talk a little bit about those challenges as we go along. Hard exterior and soft interior, right? So you got DNS layer protection, you got firewalls, you have IPSs, right? You might have some sandboxing technologies, right? But at the end of the day, you've got this nice hard crust, but in IT, for example, that crust or that perimeter is still required, but we have challenges because now we've got cloud, right? We've got mobility. So if you're securing an organization and you're putting millions of dollars in defenses on the perimeter, and you let an asset go home and plug in to the network and come back in, are you putting the organization at risk? I would say you are. And why wouldn't the same controls you have on-prem exist off-prem? Why have we taken this approach that once you go off-prem, those controls don't matter anymore, right? Those controls should follow you, at least to whatever the technology will allow you to do. So when you look at soft interior, there's things like localized malware, right? Something that gets plugged in, a USB key, for example, right? Gets plugged in, starts to propagate. You have network behavior. How many people here baseline their network? Right? Some, right? But a lot of people don't even know what the communication channels are between their devices. You're 100% reliant on your defensive technologies to tell you that something bad is happening in the environment. The one thing I'll tell you, doesn't matter what vendor you leverage, nobody's going to give you 100% security. You will be breached, right? And you want to have tools in place that are going to help you during that time. So you got supply chain. A lot of people don't even think about it. So we've seen the adversary go and compromise the website, manipulate the firmware, upload it, and then the customer goes to the website, downloads the firmware, installs it on their asset, and they're compromised, right? So you want trust throughout that whole life cycle from a supply chain perspective. Vulnerabilities, right? How many people patch? Liars. Right? We all want to patch, right? Everybody in their, throughout my entire career, we've talked about patching. But we're still seeing compromises of vulnerabilities that have patches that are available that haven't actually been pushed out. Why? Because the business doesn't want to shut it down. It's not that you guys don't say patch. It's important. Of course you are. Right? But at the end of the day, the business is driving. When I first started, someone would say, can I do this? No. I was God. It was awesome. Like, you guys missed out, some of the younger folks, right? You know what I'm talking about. Can we do this? No. You're never going to be able to do that, right? That's no longer, right? The business comes in and says, this is what I want you to do. Make it happen. So it's changed. So you got things like sanctioned devices, unsanctioned devices. How do you know a printer's plugged in? Michael and Zoe, right? They talked about printers. But do you know what printers are plugged into your network? Do you know when a phone's plugged into the network? Do you have a dynamic understanding of what the environment's doing at any given time? If you're only 100% reliant on those detection mechanisms, you better have them everywhere, right? And now you've got a costing issue. So anyways, and we see this a lot. We still see this in IT, but you see this a lot more in OT, right? If you talk to engineers, say, why do we need to do this, right? We got this crust. This crust is hard, right? You can't break. First off, the crust is never hard 100%, right? We already know that. Never mind the challenges with internal. If I wanted to compromise an operational environment, what do you think I'm going to do? Well, maybe what I'll do is go run to a field location, get a 1 gig USB key, put some good stuff on it, and drop it at the gate and drive away. Field engineer comes up and goes, oh, 1 gig USB drive, this is fantastic. It's my lucky day, right? Goes in, plugs in the operational environment, plugs in that USB key, and bang, right? And I know most people are focused on security here, and you probably all sit here and say, I would never do that. Yeah, you would. I just need to change the size of the drive. right? 1 terabyte. Oh, I know what I'm doing. I got this, right? So there's some challenges there that you got to think about. So passive defense is focusing on deploying and maintaining the controls that you put in place, right? Ultimately reducing risk. Active defense is now monitoring the environment, right? For which you're responsible for. And a lot of people don't really understand what the environment is that they're responsible for. You know, it has switches and firewalls and routers and, you know, printers and phones, but you don't truly understand the extent of all the devices that are connected to it. So you're gonna probably take a precautionary approach to this. So once you understand the environment, then you're gonna respond to incidents, right? And hopefully with some level of accuracy, right? So you're not chasing the rabbit down all kinds of different holes. And then what you're gonna do is learn from that and then manipulate the environment, right? So you're gonna take that information, you're gonna feed it back into those passive defenses to start mitigating risk, right? And of course, you know, it's a cycle, right? So you're gonna learn every time, you're gonna evolve, right, as you go along. So when you look at passive defenses, right, we've got next generation IPSs, next gen firewalls, right? Next gen endpoint. I have to use the word next gen. I apologize, right? But that's what people use to understand. Because when I go in and I say, oh yeah, we've got IPS or they've got IPS, they go, oh, it's not next gen? No, it is next gen. The problem with the next gen label, and everybody in this room should challenge it, is it never expires. So if I was an 8-year-old company that developed or was innovated and created a next gen firewall, yeah, there's core components that make up what they call next gen. But if I did that 8 years ago and did nothing, didn't change anything, and 8 years later, next gen firewall, right? It's still a next gen. It never expires. So next gen doesn't always mean next gen, right? Because then is it next gen, or is it next gen 2.0, right? There's some challenges with that term in my mind anyway. You got DNS, email security, web content. Again, just gives you an idea of some of the passive capabilities. When you look at active defense, there's 4 components, and this is from SANS, right? So you got threat intelligence, consumption. How many people take in threat feeds? Probably a lot, right? Even if you don't even know you take it in, most of your security technologies is pulling in threat data, right? You're going to have, the next step would be things like network identification, right? And this one's critical. This is the advantage you have over the adversary. You know your environment. They don't know your environment. They can assume, but they don't know your environment. So the more you know, the better that you could defend against the adversary, right? Because they got to come in and learn. Incident response, right, obviously is a part of it. And then threat and environment manipulation. So we'll talk about each one of those. So anybody know Locard's exchange principle? Anybody? So basically, if you're a criminal or an adversary, so if I'm an adversary and I enter an environment and I do nothing, or if I enter an environment and take something, there's evidence left, period, right? So it could be a fingerprint, it could be blood stain, it could be a hair follicle, right? When it comes to things like information technology, right? There could be a CPU rise, there could be increased network traffic, there could be interesting DNS calls, right? So there's evidence left. You can't get in and out without somebody having some trace. Now the issue is, do you have the mechanisms to capture that and then make sense of that, right? So threat intelligence. So there is a life cycle, right? So planning and direction. You just don't consume intelligence for the sake of intelligence, right? You want to have a plan. What are you doing? Determine those requirements. Oops. Collection. Where do you collect? Now, what's interesting here is, if you know your network, you're going to know where the best parts are in your environment to collect that data, right? But if you don't know it, it's going to be difficult, right? And everybody does perimeter. Yes, you have IPS, but how many people have security from the campus network into the data center? Well, there'll be some bigger organizations here I know have it, right? But there's a lot of organizations that don't have it. What happens when you go to the cloud? It was interesting, we were talking to students today, or just before this, and they were talking about, what about AWS? What do I need to secure my instance? The same thing you need to secure your stuff on-prem. Nothing changes, right? It's just a branch office, if anything, right? You still need the same controls. So you want to know where you're going to place this. Where are you going to get that IP fix data or flow data, right? Where are you going to put your IDSs or IPSs? Processing and exploitation. So taking binary data and making it into something usable for humans, right? And that would be ASCII. So that's what you're going to do in that phase. And then you're going to analyze and then productionize it, right? So this one's important because there's two components. This relies heavily on analysts. Analysts are never going to go away for a long time from a security perspective. Yes, we've got really cool tools that does a lot of stuff, but you still need an analyst to really truly understand the threat and what it means to the business that you're protecting, right? You need an analyst to do that. That's not going to go away. So don't worry about the technologies. It's just going to allow you to focus better. But these also have to map back to that planning and direction phase. And then you have output, right? So dissemination and integration. So the actual output of that data. That data then is going to be potentially shared. How you share that data, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But again, it's got to be something meaningful, right? It's got to come back, and this is where evaluation and feedback comes back. It's got to come back to that planning and direction phase, right? Why was I doing this in the first place? So once you get that established, then we start looking at intelligence. So open source information. Can anybody tell me how you defend against that? Anybody want to take a crack? Come on, somebody.
Be aware that it's out there.
Be aware that it's out there, right? But you can't stop it. You can put some controls in place to minimize the amount of data. But if I was going to compromise an organization, I would want to research it. Would I research it by doing an Mmap scan against their servers? No, right? I'd go to job boards. I'd read about the company a little bit. I'd find out, oh, wait a minute, they're hiring. They're hiring. Oh, and they need skill sets X, Y, and Z. That's interesting. So what do I get from that? Two things. Either they're growing the team or they're shorthanded. So not only now do I know the technologies that they use, they don't have enough people potentially monitoring those logs, right? Good information. I can scan, I can have, as if I scan them by leveraging things like Shodan. I think somebody mentioned that earlier today, right? I can look up exploit databases for exploits that I might find with the devices that I just discovered. And I've done that, right? So if you look at the city of security, because I thought I better not put any real city on here because they might call me afterwards, right? Say, hey, why did you do that? But they're building a new facility which is connected to the city of security network, right? So they got this brand new thing. Public sector is really bad or good at this, right? Because the problem with public sector in general is people want to know where their tax dollars are going. So you got to go, oh, look, this is what I'm doing, right? Oh, sorry, Mike. You're going to have to replace that. I think it's broken. But you pound the chest, right? Like, I'm so awesome. Look what I'm doing. $82 million for this section of highway, right? But if you go, there's a bunch of PR documents that would be released, right? It'll talk about who they partnered with, what companies are involved, right? Even people to communicate to. So maybe I can start actively taking that open source information and start actually probing individuals, right? And we've seen this in the real world. Product research and around advisories and alerts, right? Once I get an advisory or alert, then I go look for things like vulnerabilities, and then I go look up an exploit database, and bang. I've at this point done all of that without touching the company. I've got a plan. I know where the weaknesses may be. They're shorthanded. They're expanding their environment, right? A lot of great information. Now, again, defending against that is tough, but knowing is obviously very important, right? Knowing what's out there. And you know what? Me included, right? When you're on LinkedIn, your job description, look what I've done, right, in my career, right? So it's everywhere. Oh, wait, we got to show that one, right? But the adversary is getting all that information. So as much as you want to put that information out there for the general community, the adversary is also using that information and potentially against you. So when we look at external threat intelligence, there's all kinds of sources, right? There's ISACs, right? There's the Canadian Cyber Exchange, right? I think that's a paid option, but I'm not 100%. SAN Internet Storm Center, right? Vendor threat feeds and blogs, and you'll get reports, etc. And this is just an example of some of the intelligence that you might get from a vendor or from a third party, whatever, right? But you're going to get some IP addresses, you're going to get maybe domains, files, directory, hashes, and that, right? So what do you do with this information? Who's on blue team here? Lots? So what do? Do you go and look at your firewalls to make sure that those are in there, right? Do you ever use this information to find out whether or not you have systems internally actually making the requests outbound to those destinations? Or do you go, wait, block, I'm done, right? Well, that's what we see a lot of, right? They take that information, they block, and said, no, we're good, we're secure, right? Well, in the meantime, assets were already compromised. There's residual, there's communication coming from those devices. And yes, maybe you blocked it in the firewall, but what did we say earlier? Those devices are mobile, right? They just walked outside the environment, plugged that in, that's coffee shop, right? Any coffee shop. Connect to the internet, and now there's a CNC channel because they're no longer protected by the same mechanisms that you had at the head office, right, or in the corporate environment. Internal threat intelligence. How many people generate internal threat intelligence? Right? Remember, this is taking a step beyond passive defenses, right? So now we're looking at things like endpoint events. We're looking at traffic analysis, right? Flow data. You probably got lots of it. You just got to go turn it on, right? You might do full packet analysis, right? DNS analysis, user behavior, user information. You might have honeypots, right? And maybe you even do reverse engineering around malware, right? And again, you might be leveraging tools to do that, but also the analyst is very important in that equation. But a lot of people don't look at that internal side. They're always looking for threats and information from outside, but they need to understand that information internally as much as, and even more than what they do externally. So when it comes to sharing intelligence, you may want to classify it, right? So everybody's all about community, all about sharing, right? I've got my own thoughts about that, but we'll leave that to the side. I think it's a great thing to do, right? The more we share, the better everyone's protected. But you may not be able to share certain information. So you want to classify what you're sharing, right? So white would be something that's fine. I can share it with anybody, right? They can use this information. I can use it to share it with similar companies, right? And it's good for the community. Red might mean that you've got some interesting information in there that may expose you, right? That you may not want to share that information out. So you want to classify it, and then you may want to use a format to be able to share that data to some of your passive technologies, right? So STIX is the format, taxi's the transport to get that data to other platforms. Asset ID, network security monitoring. I think this one's the big one, right? Not to say any are less important, but this section I focus on a little bit more, and then at the end I talk a little bit about what you can do from a manipulation perspective. So how many operations rooms look like that for security? Lying, look at, you know, it hurt, didn't it? I know it hurt. The reality is that you guys do a phenomenal job. It's very hard to do it. There's all kinds of reasons why you might be blind in some areas, right? The bottom line is the end-to-end is very difficult. And I talked about this earlier. How many people could tell me what servers are in their data center? How many people could say, I know it's Windows, it's Linux, it's patch level, right? Application, right? It gets hard, right? But even just knowing the systems on your network is valuable. For data center, depending on the size of the organization, some of you guys might say, yep, 192.168, 1.0/24, those are my servers. We're all a Windows shop. We know what's going on, okay? All right, well, what about the campus? Don't say you don't care, right? Because you do, because that's probably where the attack is going to come from, right? Hopefully you fortified the data center. But again, nothing's 100%. So anyways, how many people can tell me what's on the campus? Probably very little, right? Some people might, right, depending on the technology. And some people might have a static list to be able to provide that. Again, that's really not good. It's like a pen test, right? A pen test is only as good at the moment that you do the pen test, right? It struts today, it struts version 2 tomorrow, right? Oh, and then it struts version 3, and then it struts, right? So it's only as good as the time. It's valuable information. You need to do it. But it's a little bit static, right? Same with asset inventory of your environment, right? It might be a little bit static. What about this? How many people allow this on their network? Honestly, how many networks can I plug these into and you wouldn't even know it was there, right? That's probably the bigger question. Because the reality is, you might think that your OT environment's secured. Go to the lunchroom, because somebody brought in their smart TV, plugged it into a network jack that happens to be there, that's tied into OT. Maybe you didn't stop outbound communication from OT. It's got its way into the business. I'm saying this is not good, right? And now they're watching Netflix during the day, right? During their lunchtime, right? You don't know. So how do you protect that? Turn on all the signatures. Yeah, well, now you have a box that doesn't run, right? So it's got to be dynamic. You got to know what's going on. What if you have CT scanners? Oh, we'll just throw an AV agent on it or malware. Oh, wait, the vendor void warranty. You can't do that, right? Do you know how many of those are plugged on? Are they mobile? Are they moving around in the environment being plugged in, right? There's all kinds of challenges with trying to secure that. And then if you look at a SCADA environment, now I would say out of every environment, this environment you should have locked down and know exactly what's going on, right? They're fairly static, right? They don't change as much as you see IT changes. But these are all challenges. And if you miss one of these, right, game over, right? Because that's all the adversary has to find is one. See, as security practitioners, you can be batting down hundreds of thousands of threats, right? You guys are awesome. Your team knows you're awesome. Nobody else gives a shit, right? They don't care. How many times that someone said, oh my God, look at all the stuff you've blocked. This is phenomenal. No, never. You'll never be remembered for it. You know what you'll be remembered for? How you handled the breach, right? Well, how'd they get in? Well, I don't know. There's this stupid TV, right? It's going to be hard, right, to be able to talk intelligently. It's going to take you a lot of time to figure out what's going on. And you might figure out what's going on. But that's what you're going to be remembered for. And who are you going to hire? The one that was compromised, that made mainstream media as the CISO, or somebody that may have handled a breach? Because not everybody's going to have to handle one of these at some point. Or do you hire somebody that handled the breach well, right? Still got compromised. There was still impact to the organization, but it was done in a timely manner. They had processes in place versus maybe somebody else that's been compromised. And again, it doesn't matter. You go for an interview and you say, I told them everything. Nobody listened to me. Listen, the other person that didn't have that, who do you hire? You probably take the side of caution, right? Because if you hire the individual that got breached and maybe they did do all the right things, if you get breached again, what do people say? Well, why'd you hire them? Right? So you'll never be remembered for how many threats you block or attacks that you block. So network security monitoring. So you got to start. You're going to want to collect information, right? This is why understanding the network's important, because this is where you're going to put your choke points or hotspots, right? Places that are important for you to capture data. And then you're going to detect that, right? And that detection is going to be a variety of different technologies. It could be open source technologies, commercial products, doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, you're going to need things like IDS, IPS, right? If you want to do some prevention at the same time, you want to baseline the environment. If you could do that, you're going to want to take flow data maybe in, right? And then you're going to analyze that data, and then there's going to be two results that come out of that. One is going to be you're going to kick off incident response, or the other side is it's a false positive and we're going to keep going back through that loop, right? So network security, monitoring, collection, and detection. You've got span, mirror ports, taps, etc., right? IP fix, I mentioned that, but that could be S-flow, J-flow, NetFlow, right? If we want to talk some brand names. Firewall event logs, window event logs, sys logs, right? You may aggregate that data somewhere, right? But this is all going to help you on the collection side. And then the detection side, we talked a little bit about that already, right? You're going to have maybe IDS, you'll have maybe Zigbee for some of the wireless stuff that you might have, right? You can't forget about that, right? Just because you're capturing data around wireless, right? You're going to miss anything that talks Zigbee. So again, it's important to truly understand that environment. You might have host IDS, flow data we talked about, baselines, etc. So now when you're collected the data, you've got some detection capabilities taking place, you're going to start looking at the analysis portion of it. This is where skills come in, right? Human skills, right? Not just technology. Technology will help you, maybe get rid of some of the noise, but at the end of the day, you need skill sets. So file analysis, you have DNS analysis, flow analysis, packet analysis, right? Timeline analysis, right? So we want to understand the timeline of events that took place and be able to correlate that information. So we're going to focus on flow and DNS, right? These are two examples of many, right? And how you can actually start using information to piece together what might be happening. So how many people here can pick the bad packet out of that? Right? Well, I made them red, so it makes it easier, right? But who knows, right? That's what's on the wire. If it's encrypted, it's even worse, right? So it's very, very difficult. There's all kinds of stuff happening on your network all day, every day, right? We talked about the little device earlier that they put in line, right? The thing I'm starting to think about, how do you mitigate that? Forget about the technology that should be mitigated, but how can I mitigate that risk from a network perspective, potentially, right? But they're going to leave potentially evidence, right? So I want to capture that data. And that data could be, bad geos, it could be recon, it could be compliance things that take place. I don't want my business network directly communicating with the OT environment in lower levels, right? If something like that happens, I want to know about it. Worm propagation, exfiltration, all of this you can get from flow, right? Now, you might need some technology to help interpret it. You might need an analyst to help interpret it. Probably going to need both, right? But if we look at it, here's a baseline flow, right? So you got a host A, talks to Active Directory and DNS. Might talk to a print server, God forbid, right? And email, right? And then it might talk to the internet. And there's going to be deviations in that flow, right? And you're going to have some baselines to understand what those deviations look like, right? But what if there's an unknown threat? When I say unknown, I'm saying that our technologies, not Cisco's, I'm talking our in general as an industry, hasn't been able to identify the threat. It's unknown. I apologize, Russia, but I'm going to use you as the example. Right? But if I had some communication that's taking place, that's communicating to Russia. I was actually in Vancouver yesterday, and we had an individual, and this wasn't part of the discussion, but we did talk about Russia, and I said, yeah, I use it once in a while, but sometimes I try not to, because you point out a country, and somebody gets upset, and he's like, and he's Russian, he goes, oh no, I've went through this ransomware experience where I called them up and said, I'm Russia. They were willing to give him back the crypto keys because he was Russian, but he needed to give his passport and picture and prove he was in Moscow, right, to get the keys, right? So he didn't get the keys, but he was Russian. He sounded Russian. But so host A talks to a server that's located in Russia. We know proxying, all that, but forget it, was just an example. But the line there is a little bit thicker, And what that represents is there's volume of traffic that is increased compared to the other communication channels. So that's interesting. So that took place. And now host A is talking to host B, C, and D. Never did before. Now you might say, well, we have a technology that does chatting and that communication's there. Yeah, based on that protocol, right? And we baseline that. But this might be a different protocol that's being leveraged, right? Maybe they're expanding and taking advantage of a vulnerability. Maybe it's okay. Maybe they lit up a new service, and how many security teams get involved in that until it's too late, right? You get brought in, oh yeah, we're lighting this up. Can you secure it? Yeah, I need $1 million. Oh no, you're not getting any budget. We already spent it. Okay. So now you have host B, C, and D. They're all talking to that same server. Would that be interesting to everybody in the room? It would be, right? Now remember, nobody's seeing that because you're not capturing flow data. So you don't even know what's happening. And again, it's an unknown threat. So it's not like a blacklisted CNC, right, that it's communicating with. We don't even know yet. So anyways, that's interesting. So when you look at flow, it's 5-tuple, right? Source IP, source port, destination IP, destination port, and then protocol. So host A would be an IP address, right? The source port would be whatever, right? You got an IP address, you've got the destination port and IP, and then the protocol. And then now, whether you have technology that'll help you through this process, or whether you start looking up and doing your own analysis, I can use that flow data and start building out something important, right? So that's interesting, right? Now I get start and end time. What's that going to do? That's going to help me know the timeline, right, of when the events took place. It's valuable, right? User and device type. Now this could be stitched into the flow depending on what you're using, or you're going to cross-reference that, right? Because you've got the source IP address. Now you're going to DHCP. You're looking at that timeline. You're cross-correlating. It's that Active Directory user during that time, right? A lot of work, though, right? But that flow data is going to help you move along. Receive and transmit, right? So I can get some interesting stuff from that. We'll talk about that in a second. Round trip time and server response time. In this case, because it's going to Russia, you probably don't care because your users aren't calling you saying, I can't get it, it's taking forever, right? But if this was an internal flow to a database backend, that return trip time is the network, the entire time from client to server and everything in between, right? Server response time is telling you how long it took the server to actually respond to the request. How many people are here in networking? Couple, right? How many times is the network the problem? Right? I started on the networks, well, systems in the network, right? But how many times is it really the network, right? Very, very seldom, right? But it's this black box nobody knows about. So they always say, well, it's the network, go back and check. No, now I can say the server held it for 200 milliseconds. I know that, right? Again, you might need other tools to help you get that information. I'm just including it to be comprehensive here. URI, right? That's interesting data. Because again, destination IP is one thing, but if I have the URI, now I can see exactly what they were calling. Device process. So imagine I'm able now to take this information in that timeline and correlate it back to the endpoint to find out what the device process that actually made the call outbound. Right? Maybe it was SVC host using NT authority subsystem. That's interesting. Right? Shut it down. Okay, so now I've got potentially data exfiltration. I'm going to help you along, right? And then we've got some SMB. Don't worry about the source port. That could be anything, right? I didn't fix the slide, but because I don't want to say SMB doesn't work that way, right? But anyways, you've got the same data points, right? The only thing different is the protocol and then who it's communicating, but you have 3 of those instances, right? And you could imagine if this was some type of tool, a mechanism to propagate, right? Does anybody know recently what used 445? Anybody? Come on, security, somebody's got to say it. Don't be shy. Yeah, right? Eternal blue, right? Being able to propagate using SMB. So we see an SMB probe. We don't know what it is, right? So potentially exfiltration because we see volumes of data, right? and potentially an SMB probe. So incident response kicks off, right? Your team now is going to get involved. They're going to start using this to do their analysis, and we're going to come back to that. Now, when we look at DNS traffic, there's some interesting stuff. So you've got this, let me click this. You've got this domain, right? So you might have gotten this information through third-party intelligence, right? And again, this might be more of an incident response kickoff, but it doesn't matter, right? You're doing analysis and it's around DNS. So now I know this domain. So what I can do is I can do a who is. Again, you might have tools that help accelerate this process, or you might be using, you know, third-party tools, open source tools, going to Google, who is, right? So I've got a domain name. What do I need? I've got to go quick here, 41. What do I need in order to register a domain? An email address, right? And then it's going to go on top of some infrastructure. So if I'm a criminal organization, I'm probably going to leverage a lot of the same stuff, right? I'm not, because remember, I use maybe fraudulent credit cards to build the infrastructure. So I'm not going to do that every single time. So there might be some commonalities. But now I know that that individual has had other domains, and in the past they have been bad. I can now pivot from each one of those, and I get what networks they're part of, right? Maybe some reputation type information, right? I can also see the number of queries, so I can actually say what does a query look like for a campaign, marry that up to what an exploit kit campaign might look like, and make a decision, right? I get IP addresses. From that IP address, I get more domains that potentially are malicious. So you can see where this is going. You've taken one data point and you've went and blocked it in your passive defense. And you've missed all of this, right? You could actually stay ahead maybe here, right? But we started with that original domain. We've got an IP, and now we've got 3 additional domains. So that's interesting. So incident response kicks off. And I'm just going to fast track this, okay? So you've got preparation. I didn't think I had enough. I thought it was going to be done in like 30 minutes. You know when you're prepped, right? You're just like, wow, I'm in trouble. I'm not even going to. And then you talk. And I like to talk. And anyway, so preparation for incident response. I kind of broke this up for folks that aren't in IR, right? So this is the life cycle, right? So you have preparation. And again, you guys will get these slides. You got detection and analysis. You got containment, right? And obviously eradicate the threat, and then recovery. And then you got post-activity, right? Lessons learned, et cetera, right? So that's going to kick off. And then in that, you're going to have chain of command. You're going to have your incident handlers that are going to report to the lead responder that's going to give guidance and timelines and stuff like that, right? They're going to shield the handlers from management, right? We all love management, but we don't need management to be behind the analyst that's trying to do the work, right? It doesn't help. And then you have the director, right? The director kind of filters the entire team from the business in general, but also is probably point of contact for communications, right? And then you've got IR, external communication. So you might have to go and talk to law enforcement, depending on what the breach might be, internal BUs, et cetera. So now when you take that flow, now I've got host user insight. So now I know the host and potentially user behavior. I've got an OS device type, so maybe I know some vulnerabilities exist on that asset, right? Again, I'm painting a picture here. Application, so now I might know it's vulnerable, right? Maybe it's process hollowing. Maybe there's additional analysis that has to take place there. IP address and geolocation. Domain and full URI. Ports and protocols. Application, so maybe we've identified the app itself. And then volume of traffic, right? So those are all things that I could discover from flow. When you look at DNS, you can see maybe you've got some domains that were identified as bad, but as you start painting this out, you might find that hashes are also associated to that domain, right? And as you move along, you might find the download URL. You might have domains that co-occur. What that means is when I go to your site, I might have came from that site or this site, right? I might go there or I might have come from there, right? But that might help me tie the attack infrastructure together, right? I get popped by the exploit kit, then I go to the CNC, get the file, go finally to get the encryption keys and get encrypted, right? So if we look here, we got the email address. Oh, wait, I just skipped that part, didn't I? Sorry. These domains all share the same infrastructure. These three folks in the front here, right? We've got the email address registered, the infection point, the current malware distribution point, and then we potentially can start looking at things like DGAs and potential future infrastructure that's going to be leveraged against us, right? So threat emulation of the environment. So this is the final pieces, right? Is that I'm going to take this information and I'm going to use it now, right? This team's going to help use it, and this is going to be turned on passive defense potentially as well, right? So segmentation and patching. So now I can maybe segment those assets, get them segmented, right? Maybe there's still some communications. Let's get them patched, right? Again, this will be a decision, right? I'm just giving you an idea of some of the things that the outcomes might be. The device process, maybe you'll blacklist the process if you can. If it's SVC host, you're going to have to think about what you're doing. You don't want to blacklist explorer.exe, right? Because that's not good, right? You might patch. You have geo and IP blacklist, right? Blacklist the domain, develop an IPS signature that matches the URI, right? So now I'm taking that information, building a signature, now mitigating risk. Blacklist the app, right? Restrict the app, patching, right? And then rate limit. Now in this case, if this was talking to Russia with large volumes, you're not going to rate limit it, right? You're probably going to cut it off, right? But there might be another use case where you've done your incident response, found out that there's no threat to the organization, but there is a business productivity issue, and you want to slow down that access because it's not business enhancing that they're doing. SMB probe, microsegmentation, right? Both sides, patching, blacklist app, patching, restrict app, etc. The domain, I can block the sender, right? So I can make sure that if they ever try to send us mail, right? Because remember, they're learning about your environment too, right? They're looking to expand. Maybe I block the sender. Blacklist the domains, blacklist the IPs. I think you guys get it. So your network, your system, they all leave evidence, right? You just got to figure out a way to capture that and store it in a meaningful manner that you can then query at some point in time and run analysis on it. And that's it.